There's nothing on this planet like speaking after Mark. If you've got any energy left, we're going to cover one or two things that weren't covered, if I can figure out what they were. Okay. And need an Al Gore-style tech guy here pretty soon, probably. About that science issue. I always thought that when President Obama said after his election that he was going to restore science to its rightful place, that meant nowhere it could get in the way. But we see today in the Washington Post that he has pledged to shield science from politics. Let's pause, wait for laughter. Shield science, is this thing on? Shield science from politics. All right. You mentioned the huts, Mark. What about those huts? Let's say resume slideshow. I owe someone in this audience credit for this slide, in fact. Mr. Ed Begley, Green leader that he is, made a comment recently that revealed the entire elite mentality behind this agenda. Gore. F5. Okay. About those huts. Who would want to live in a hut? Nobody would want to live in a hut. This is about other people and how they live. Ed Begley says it's much cheaper for everybody in Africa to have electricity where they need it, on their huts. Right where they belong. And this is the kind of energy transmission line they like, of course, as you see. No need spending time going to school and doing other things. Could just lead to having children. So now we're going to talk about what I came here to talk about. Threats to U.S. sovereignty, ditching the Article 2 treaty process for Kyoto 2. You didn't know this, but you're the perfect enemy. We have long, apparently, confronted a well-organized, well-funded group, the Club of Rome, who decided that they were searching for a new enemy, and in identifying one, they had to imagine new strategies, new weapons, and in searching for a new enemy to unite the people to advance their agenda, they came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, and the entire parade of horribles would fit the bill. Okay, this is a very useful catastrophe. It's now a necessary catastrophe because the same President Obama has now ensured that catastrophic man-made global warming or carbon dioxide emissions are a virtuous, indispensable contributor to the public purse, raising between $80 billion per year and $300 billion per year to pay for social engineering. It can never go away. If you thought we need the lottery because it pays for the schools raised issues, stop and think about this. So how do we fight that enemy at the gates? Through climate non-aggression pacts. We had our first, really, in 1992. And then we had the amendment to the Rio Treaty, the Global Treaty, Kyoto, the Global Treaty covering 35 industrial titans, Luxembourg, Belgium, Iceland, Slovenia, and Slovakia. Sorry, President Klaus. But not China, India, Mexico, South Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, top 15 emitters all, which would matter if emissions mattered, but this has never been about emissions. It's also 150 other countries are free riding on it. None of these countries were ever the point of Kyoto. We were the point of Kyoto. We were those who had to, or at least whose lifestyle had to be brought into check. At the time of Kyoto's design, Asia wasn't really a concern of individuals like Margot Wallström, who said this isn't about science, it's about leveling the playing field, a cry for help that socialism doesn't work, a cry that we're not listening to. We were the ones who had to cede control of our economic decisions. Jacques Chirac did in fact say this. I was in the room. Congressman James Sensenbrenner held an impromptu press conference outside and had the British press swearing back at him when he was dismissing. He was saying, if you ever want to keep the United States out of an agreement, call it the first component of an authentic global warming. They could not figure out what problem he had with that. So here's the constitutional impediment. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution says the President shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided, here's the problem, provided 2/3 of the Senate present concur. So let's walk through Kyoto's history. It was unanimous Senate advice it was not solicited, I have an old version of this talk with me, that was given in 1997 not to agree to Kyoto. The advice was not solicited. It was given because they saw what the administration was up to. And they said, don't go do it. Unanimous means bipartisan. On December 11th, mere months later, Al Gore went to Kyoto and announced his agreement. In contravention of a unanimous Senate acting pursuant to its constitutional authority. Of course, on August 4th, Ken Lay and John Brown had met in the Oval Office with Bill and Al and said, thou shalt go to Kyoto and thou shalt agree to a treaty, and here's what it has to have in it. I don't know where they are in the Constitution, probably in the back with all the scary stuff. Now, the U.S. signs Kyoto, believe it or not. We signed the Kyoto Protocol a year later. Neither President Clinton nor President Bush ever bothered to ask the Senate to ratify the treaty. That request is not required in the Constitution or in statute. There is nothing saying the Senate can't bring it up for a vote if they want to. It's duly signed. But we have rested on this idea of protocol. The President needs to ask us. So the reason this dance is relevant is they will never get the two-thirds approval for anything resembling Kyoto. So some people are looking for ways around it. Just for this one issue, as I pointed out in Red Hot Lies, the increasing number of opinion leaders who began in the UK, but now it's spreading, former oil executives in the United States, for example, are saying just on this one issue, it's just too important to be left to democracy. So just for this one little issue, we need to suspend certain arcane notions of democracy and individual economic liberties just for this one issue of energy, which is the economy and national security, sovereignty, just for this one issue, and even praising China as the sole way to make this happen. We need to somehow just have a little slice of China in our system to make this thing happen. Mayor Hillman, among others, I quote in the book as saying that's just a wonderful way to go, but just for this one issue. It's the only way we'll get what we need done. Now, here's the threat. Former Clinton-Gore State Department aide Nigel Purvis, who's with the Brookings Institute, was asked to write a paper for Resources for the Future. And he says the United States should classify new international treaties to protect the Earth's climate system as executive agreements rather than treaties. In other words, Kyoto 2, after you come back from Kyoto waving Greenpeace in our time, you'll say, oh, but look, it says here it's not a treaty. It's exactly the same as it otherwise would have been, but as he says, no matter if anyone else in the world calls it a treaty, so long as we don't, we just need 50 plus 1. Because apparently, and you didn't know this, but the treaty clause has never worked as the framers of the Constitution intended. It's become inconvenient, English to English translation. The treaty process created by the framers of the Constitution requires an exceptional degree of national consensus that is no longer reasonable given the frequency and importance of international cooperation today. So a power instituted to check an executive running around the world willy-nilly entangling us in international agreements has now become overtaken by events because we're just engaging in them so often we need to suspend it. This is climate logic. It's so 18th century we moved on. You say congressional agreement, I say treaty. Under international law, he writes, those two types of instruments are indistinguishable. They're both the supreme law of the land. Here's the important part, he says. The domestic processes the United States uses to negotiate, review, and approve them are quite different. So you see, one's much easier. One's much easier. So the United States may deem an international agreement, this is a quote, as an executive agreement for the purposes of its domestic review, Senate approval, even though the international community may decide to call the pact a treaty. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Curious rationale. So we need not cling to preconceived notions of how our country negotiates and preconceived notions, reviews international climate agreements, because the treaty process has harmed the credibility of the United States. In the eyes of the world, we are an unreliable treaty partner. Why? Because the Senate instructed the executive to not do something, the executive did it. So we need to take the Senate out of the process because that makes us look flaky. Unilateral presidential leadership may prove necessary if Congress refuses to act. So how would this work? He proposes a three-tiered bill. The first is to provide non-binding guidance on the pact. Here's what it should look like. Okay, now remember the previous instructions were pursuant to the Constitution ignored. We're going to suspend the Constitution and say, here's some non-binding, like the other, guidance as to how this treaty should look, this executive agreement should look. But come back and give us something that we promise. You have authority to negotiate something else, and we promise a vote. But it's a different kind of vote. We promise a no amendment, no filibuster, up or down, simple bicameral, 50-plus majority vote, not two-thirds of the Senate, which has proven so inconvenient. So, in effect, you waive Article 2, Section 2's consent because you jointly agree that it really isn't a treaty, even if the rest of the world calls it one. And our courts are supposed to now take a look at what other courts are saying, and if the rest of the world calls it a treaty, I don't know why we, given Justice Kennedy's opinions, shouldn't as well, but we have certain things to get around, like the Constitution. So we need to agree in the third part of the bill to successive deeper implementation. That's relevant for the lawyers in the audience. There's a Medellin problem. A recent case, the Supreme Court said that treaties are not necessarily self-implementing or self-executing unless they say so, and Kyoto and its successor certainly do not. So in other words, previously we had a threat that Kyoto could be deemed as somehow self-executing, but now the court has made clear that it wouldn't be. This gets them around that problem because in the original legislation, you agree to implement it. In fact, you agree to the first stage of implementation first. And then if you say, well, NAFTA was a congressional agreement, that's true, but this isn't NAFTA. This is not three countries agreeing to reduce trade barriers. This is about one country in particular agreeing to increase energy taxes, export wealth in return for indulgences and certificates under CDM and so on. It's a treaty under which every nation in the world as an indispensable party must be at the table, just not be covered. Remember, this paradigm is every nation is indispensable to be at the table, but it's not fair to ask anything of them except to receive the bags of money. Okay, it also has rigged baselines, for example. We'll talk about this in the European panel this afternoon, but it has rigged baselines. 1990 is the baseline for a treaty that goes into effect 2008, negotiated in 1997. You'd say that's arbitrary, except it's not. It's to take into account the post-1990, post-Soviet economic collapse, which actually Eastern European nations are now calling the post-Soviet economic collapse early action. True story. Not making that up. You get around the Medellin problem, there's no escape hatch of Congress of the gesture problem. We signed Kyoto, and then we told the Senate, you're going to have to ratify it, but I'm not going to publicly say that. We tried to pressure, the Clinton-Gore approach was to pressure Congress by ignoring the advice, signing a treaty, and then saying, hey, it's your burden now. Well, of course, then it was George Bush's burden. We know he really refused to sign the treaty that Bill Clinton signed, but Barack Obama has indicated he wants to reverse that process. He's going to, he says, take an enrolled domestic law to the negotiations and tell the Europeans this is what we can do and walk away with that as our position. We shall see. Again, I'm sorry, I for some reason have an older version of this presentation, but some European politicians have come out recently indicating that they may not like that idea and that what they say really should matter to us. So Purvis says the courts would be highly likely to uphold the agreement. He may be right. We can all say what a court might say because it's a mere historical tendency of the United States to call such international pacts treaties, and therefore we can just wink and nod. In fact, if it appears that Congress and Obama opt for this, for a congressional executive agreement instead of a treaty, that is negotiating a treaty, but when you land, say, but it's really not a treaty, don't listen to what everyone else is calling it, you've only got one opportunity, one sure opportunity to block it. You can't filibuster the vote. That's the point behind this. And you don't need 2/3. You need 50 plus 1. And you cannot guarantee what our courts are going to do. On this, I think we can all agree. So you have one opportunity to block this, and that's when the opportunity for, this is called fast track. We've done it before, like NAFTA, for trade agreements. You have one opportunity, and that's to oppose fast track, to reject the opportunity to negotiate this pact. For example, you've seen they're already looking to impose the domestic tax scheme needed to implement this pact through the filibuster-proof budget process, which is an indication of intent and mindset. I believe they're backing off of that. But the fact that they considered it is fairly alarming. You need to block the request for Kyoto 2 authority. Do not let it get to the fast track stage. Do not let it get to the courts. Expose this now. If exposure fails, demand filibuster of the request. Remember, the Constitution, like the free market, is not perfect. It's just an awful lot better than what we have now. Thank you.